Alrighty, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, whenever you happen to be looking into this. We are still in the 1920s with chapter 24, the reactionary 20s. We'll talk about all the other things that are going on. So we'll start with Mr. Shaw here. Maybe. There we go.
The dramatic stock market crash in the fall of 1929 did not cause the Great Depression, but it certainly revealed hidden weaknesses in the American economy that had been developing during the 1920s. In particular, by 1927, major components of the American economy were slowing down, especially construction and automobiles. In addition, there had developed a terrible imbalance during the 1920s between productivity and profits on the one hand and wages on the other. That is, corporations were reaping record levels of profits, but their workers' income was not keeping up with production. As a result, there was a growing gap between American productivity and American buying power. So by the 1930s, Americans simply could not buy enough of the goods that were being churned out by American industry. And that gap was the primary cause of the Great Depression, coupled with the fact that the agricultural sector, the farm sector, never enjoyed great prosperity in the 20s. In fact, it had been in a slump throughout that decade. So when the industrial sector slowed down and crashed, the agricultural sector was not there to complement or back it up. It was already languishing. Taken together, agricultural and industrial collapse meant depression.
Alrighty. So, excuse me. Let's start with nativism. So by the 1920s, over half of the white men and a third of the white women working in industry were immigrants, mostly from Eastern Europe. That socialism and anarchism also come from these areas is not lost on those with nativist tendencies. Soon these immigrants are viewed as suspect, and nativism once again swept the nation. And remember, the idea of nativism is the fact that if you were native born to the United States, you were better than an immigrant coming in. This leads to demands to limit immigration into the United States. You have a series of laws that are adopted that limit the number of immigrants per country per year. The rise of nativist sentiment led many to restrict immigration into the United States. The only group that was successfully excluded were the Chinese. President Chester Arthur initially vetoed the bill, but it was overturned by Congress. The most celebrated criminal case during this time linked radicalism and immigration reform. Two self-described anarchists, Niccolo Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti, were arrested in connection with a robbery and murder. Stolen money was never found, but both were convicted in a widely publicized trial. They were eventually executed. So basically you have Sacco and Vanzetti, two Italian immigrants, who claim themselves as anarchists. I've also read that they're socialist. So I'm not sure entirely if maybe they had leanings towards both or what, but either way it was bad. And they were essentially used as an example. There was evidence to the fact that they were not there the night of the robbery, that they were elsewhere. It is, I would say, most likely agreed upon at this point in history that they did not commit these crimes. But they were arrested for them. They were tried for them. Evidence was kind of hidden, lost, excluded, etc. They were found guilty. They were sentenced to death, and then they were executed. So this just kind of goes to show you how severe this nativism was and that fear of these different ideas. All right. So the KKK is going to find life in this nativist surge. So no longer limited to the South, the Klan is a reaction against shifting moral standards, the rise in the number of immigrants, and the declining influence of churches. You have fundamentalism. It's the belief that the Bible should not be viewed under scientific scholarship, a trend that had been growing since Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. It had first been introduced. 1925, Tennessee outlawed the teaching of evolution in schools and colleges. All right. So this is the Scopes monkey trial. So you have a young school teacher. His name is John Scopes. He disobeys this law saying you can't teach evolution. And the trial erupts with our friend, never the winner, William Jennings Bryan, as the prosecution. This is the time he wins. And Charles Darrow of Chicago as the defense lawyer. So basically, there's this law, and they looked for somebody to challenge the law, and this man decided to challenge the law, and so he's supposed to teach creation in class, in biology class, mind you, and he decides to teach evolution, and he's arrested for it. He's put on trial. He is found guilty, but about a year later, the Tennessee Supreme Court overturns the fine. He was charged a fine. I don't remember what the fine is, but his fine is overturned on a technicality. But it leaves that anti-evolution law in place. So this is often called and referred to as the Scopes monkey trial for various reasons. But you can come to your own conclusions. But it was kind of like a three-ring circus. And I believe there's film of it. There's also radio. It's not televised. It's I don't know what the word would be. But anyway, it was played on the radio so people could hear it. At their homes. I think this was, 1925. So anyway, moving on. Here is the KKK in their nice outfits here. Stage a huge parade down Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. in 1925. So moving north. This is the monkey trial here. Okay, so the media, food vendors, and others flocked to Dayton, Tennessee for the case against John T. Scopes, the teacher who taught evolution. I'm assuming the man standing is Clarence Darrow, but I cannot guarantee that. All right, Prohibition, ratified in 1918 in the 18th with the 18th Amendment. Although it made the sale of liquor illegal, it was impossible to enforce. The manufacture and distribution of alcohol during this time period encouraged organized crime to control it, leads to an increase in criminal violence and smuggling. So this law that they want to bring into place to help save society, keep the men from drinking and keep them at home and spending all the money, actually causes more crime. There is a crime increase during Prohibition because it is impossible to tell people not to drink. All right, 1920 election for president. Republicans choose Warren G. Harding as their candidate, and Democrats choose James Cox. Harding proposes a return to normalcy in his campaign, so basically going back to the way the United States was before World War I, and he does win the presidency. Harding, who a lot like Grant was a poor selector of qualified candidates for his cabinet, many of his appointees landed in prison or barely escaped prosecution. During his administration, he would push for and receive an increase in the protective tariff. Harding dies during his presidency, I think 1923, and most of the scandals come out after his death, and it is likely he didn't know anything about them, but I think we'll talk about them in just a second. All right, the unions had been weakened by the Red Scare, the strikes of 1919. A brief depression in 1921 further adds to the weakness. Membership drops by 1.5 million in 1929 to 3.5 million. Dropped by 1.5 million, not from. All right. So it was 5 million prior to that. Anti-union sentiment was strong in the South. During the war, demands for military clothing created a boom for the textile-based South. After the war, the lack of military need as well as changing fashion for women caused a dramatic decline in the need for Southern products. A prolonged walkout at the Luray Mill in Gastonia, North Carolina, escalated into conflict and involved 2 deaths. So this is the Gastonia strike. You have female textile workers going to pit their strength against that of a National Guardsman during a strike at the Luray Mill in Gastonia, North Carolina in 1929. Who do you think is going to win? We should have competition. All right. Following the conclusion of the Great War, most Americans desired to return to their isolationist days before the war. The Red Scare, the return to a high tariff rate, and immigration restriction were all examples of these desires. Although the United States would never join the League of Nations, it's not long before it sent unofficial observers to the League to combine forces to fight international crime. War loans to the Allies were contingent on reparations from the Germans. When the Great Depression struck, Germany begins to get loans from the United States to pay its debts. After a one-year moratorium negotiated by Hoover, the Allies would default on their loans. Congress would forbid further loans to any government that had already defaulted on its debts to the United States. So Germany is blamed for the war. Germany has to pay for the war. Germany's got no money. So who do they call? The big bad United States to pay back the money. Now, mind you, there are other people who borrow money from the United States too. So, let's see. After the war, the United States chose not to maintain its army, but did build up the Navy to be second in the world behind Britain. Neither of these nations feared the other's intentions, but both feared Japanese expansion in the Pacific. At the Washington Conference in 1922, the Five-Power Treaty was signed, limiting England, the United States, Japan, Italy, and France to a maximum number of naval vessels. Moreover, all agreed they would further refrain from fortifying their Pacific possessions. This was a treaty originally intended for France and the United States, but eventually was signed by 62 nations, which made waging war illegal. It has no enforcement mechanism. All right. Major issue of Harding's administration was the Teapot Dome scandal. Teapot Dome was a government-owned oil deposit that was administered by the Interior Department. Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall, let private companies exploit the oil there, and soon afterward was discovered to have taken bribes in return for allowing the companies to have their way. Harding would die in office before too many of these scandals erupted. And why is it called Teapot Dome? It's because it's located in Teapot Dome, Wyoming. All right. Harding was succeeded by his vice president, Calvin Coolidge, who believed that the presidency should return to the post-imperialistic ways introduced by Roosevelt. So, and you have to understand a lot about these presidents during the 20s. They just really had that belief they shouldn't be involved in people's lives. So, keep that in mind as we move forward. This is a 1924 cartoon alluding to the dimensions of the Teapot Dome scandal. You can see that Teapot's going to roll them down. Kill them Republicans. All right. Coolidge believed that business were the best entity to regulate businesses. He distanced himself with the corruption of the Harding administration and in 1924 was nominated for his own term by the Republican Party. The Democrats nominated Robert La Follette. Coolidge wins. So, another Republican president. All right. The efficiency craze, already discussed in early chapters, led to the transformation of the Commerce Department into the most active agency in the government. Led by Herbert Hoover, it encouraged economic growth and the creation of more trade associations to stabilize the market. This is how Herbert Hoover gets his leg in the game here. Farmers were still the weakest sector of the economy. Elevated by the wartime boom, the farmers bought on credit to plant and harvest more. When the boom ended, they found themselves with too much land and too much debt. As a result, farms were foreclosed on and bankruptcies were rampant. Congress tried to help them, but by the time the legislation was passed, it's vetoed by Coolidge, who considered the concept unconstitutional. All right. After Coolidge announces he would not run for a second term, the Republicans nominate Herbert Hoover to succeed him. The Democrats nominate Alfred Smith, governor of New York. Smith is also a Catholic, and there's still very high anti-Catholic sentiment, and so it is likely, that's a big part of the problem of why he didn't win. It leads the KKK to wage political warfare against him, and the election is a landslide for Hoover. When Hoover becomes president, he sets his sights on propping up the agricultural sector, which Coolidge had refused to do. A new tariff raised duties to an all-time high. Even though he was petitioned by over 1,000 economists to veto the bill, Hoover signed it, and it becomes law. Campaign sheet music. So sheet music for the Democratic nominee, Alfred Smith, and the Republican nominee, Herbert Hoover, drew on popular tunes and motifs of the time. Imagine if we had sheet music for Trump, what that would look like. Or for Clinton. Interesting. This is Mr. Hoover here. President Hoover. He says, "I have no fears for the future of our country." He told the nation this at his inauguration in 1929. So he's elected in 1928, and he's not inaugurated till 1929, and that's in March of 1929. Anybody know when the stock market crashes? Anybody? October 29th. So 6 months, maybe 7 months? All right. The rapid growth of the economy in the post-war boom continues, and most Americans did not even consider the possibility of a drop in the markets. However, by 1929, the stock market had escalated beyond control, and many Americans bought into the age-old gamble of speculation. Except this time it was not in land, but the purchase of stocks. So basically, they bought stocks on credit, money they didn't have, assuming that the stock would increase in prices and they would just receive their profit. So on October 29, 1929, the stock market crashes, shedding 37% of its value. Hoping that it would rebound, many sold and bought again, only to be trapped again in the falling market. Americans began to watch their expenditures more carefully, and as a result, a panic turns into a depression, with 25% of the workforce unemployed. The stock market crash did not cause the Great Depression, but it does reveal the weaknesses of the American economic system. Government policies also added to the decline. The tariff continued unabated, and Americans who could purchase goods found themselves taxed to a high degree. All right. As the news of the Great Crash spreads across the world, people rush to banks to withdraw their deposits, causing all the bank failures in 1933. By 1933, 13 million people were no longer employed, and those who still had jobs found themselves working fewer hours. Soup kitchens were created to feed the hungry, and local welfare agencies ran out of charity and funds. Thousands of unemployed men hopped trains in search of jobs, known as hobos. They continued on the rails until they found employment. Hoover tried to restore American confidence in the economy by accelerating the start of government-funded construction projects to employ more people. However, as these projects expanded, local and state government agencies continued to cut back. And I'm sure we'll talk more about Hoover when we get to the next chapter. But understand, many people call Hoover the do-nothing president, but he did a lot more than presidents prior to him, and he was really of that old-school belief that government should not be involved in people's everyday lives. The roof may come crashing down on me. It's a lot of noise up there. Anyway, that is all I have for right now, so I hope you have a good morning, afternoon, or evening whenever you are listening to this, and I will see or speak to you soon. Bye.